He won twin Chinese girls in a poker game as a cruel joke. Their first words made the rancher go pale. In the heart of the town stood the old saloon, its swinging doors creaking as a few locals wandered in to escape the evening heat. Inside, the air was thick with smoke from cigars and the low murmur of voices. The saloon was dimly lit by lanterns that cast flickering shadows across the rough wooden tables and the worn floor. It was the kind of place where fortunes were made or lost in a single hand, and where the brave, or the foolish, tested their luck against one another. Hank, a tall and broad-shouldered rancher known for his sharp wit and sharper temper, pushed through the doors and into the saloon. His boots made a heavy thud on the wooden floor as he moved toward the poker table in the center of the room. Hank had earned a reputation across the county for his gambling skills, and his presence immediately drew the attention of everyone around. He was a man who thrived on risk, who enjoyed the thrill of winning not just money, but respect and fear from those around him. To him, a poker game was not merely about cards. It was a test of character, a battlefield where cunning and nerve determined the outcome. That evening, the poker table was already crowded. A group of local ranchers and townsmen were gathered, each with their own stack of coins, ready to stake their fortunes. The room buzzed with tension as the dealer shuffled the deck with practiced precision. Hank's eyes scanned the table and then, almost instinctively, he noticed something unusual near the corner of the saloon. Two young Chinese girls, identical twins, were quietly seated with an older man, presumably their father. They seemed out of place in the bustling, rough-and-tumble environment of the saloon, yet they carried themselves with a quiet dignity that immediately caught Hank's attention. The twins were perhaps 9 or 10 years old, with delicate features, dark almond-shaped eyes, and hair neatly tied back. They spoke very little, but the calmness in their demeanor suggested intelligence beyond their years. Their father, a traveling merchant, was speaking in low tones, clearly anxious about the environment his daughters were in. Hank, curious and ever impulsive, leaned back in his chair, observing them. The idea that these young girls could be used as part of a joke or a test of bravado flitted across his mind. In that moment, a cruel idea began to take shape, one that Hank would later recognize as a terrible mistake, but at the time seemed almost harmless to him, a bit of fun at the poker table. The game began with the usual intensity. Coins clinked against each other, cards were dealt with swift precision, and the players exchanged tense glances. Hank's hands were steady, his mind sharp. He raised and folded, bluffed and called, all while keeping one eye on the twins and their father. The more he watched, the more he was struck by how composed they were. Even in the chaos of the saloon, they remained calm, their movements deliberate, their expressions serene. As the game progressed, the stakes grew higher. Hank's stack of coins had increased steadily, and the tension in the room was palpable. The other players were sweating, biting their lips, and glancing nervously at Hank, who seemed to be completely in control. Then, in a moment of what he thought was playful mischief, Hank decided to make a bold wager. He slammed his hand on the table and with a grin declared that he would bet the twins themselves. The room fell silent. For a few seconds, no one could speak. The laughter that Hank had expected did not come at first. Instead, there were murmurs of shock and disbelief. The dealer hesitated, looking from Hank to the merchant, unsure of what to do. The twins' father's face went pale. His lips moved, but no sound came out at first. Hank's grin faltered for a moment as he realized that the atmosphere had changed. This was no longer a harmless joke. Despite the tension, Hank pressed on, joking and laughing as if to lighten the moment. "Don't worry, old man," he said. "It's just a bit of fun. The cards will decide. Let's see who's lucky tonight." But the joke, meant to amuse, carried a weight that Hank could not fully grasp. The dealer, feeling the pressure of the moment, finally turned the cards over. Hank had a winning hand, a perfect combination that left no room for argument. The coins on the table were his, and now, according to the cruel rules he had jokingly set, he won the twins. The father, a small man with little choice in the matter, reluctantly nodded. He knew that defying Hank in front of the crowd could have dangerous consequences. The twins, for their part, remained silent, observing everything with quiet, intelligent eyes. Hank motioned for them to follow him, expecting fear or resistance, but the girls simply got up, their faces calm, their movements precise. Even in the face of an absurd and terrifying situation, they carried themselves with dignity. As Hank led them out of the saloon, the crowd's reaction was mixed. Some laughed nervously, unsure whether the situation was real or staged. Others shook their heads, sensing the cruelty beneath the laughter. The twins walked side by side, glancing at the rancher only once, their eyes calm but piercing, as if silently questioning his choices. Hank, for the first time, noticed something unsettling. The girls were not afraid in the way he expected, and their quiet confidence began to gnaw at him. The journey back to Hank's ranch was tense but uneventful. The sun had dipped below the horizon, and the first stars were beginning to appear. Hank felt a strange sense of anticipation mixed with unease. What had started as a joke now carried a weight he could not ignore. The twins, though silent, seemed to understand the power dynamic at play. Their intelligence and composure hinted at the possibility that they would not be easily intimidated or controlled. When they arrived at the ranch, Hank showed them to a small guest room near the main house. The girls quietly stepped inside, surveying the simple furnishings, the wooden bed, and the faint smell of livestock in the air. Hank watched them closely, trying to read their expressions. He expected fear, but instead he saw calm assessment, as if the girls were taking stock of their surroundings and planning their next moves. Their first words, when they finally spoke, were not cries of fear or pleas for mercy, but a simple, calm question. Why are we here? He had not expected words like this from children. The girl's tone was not angry or frightened. It was steady, precise, and filled with a quiet authority that made him realize the absurdity of his actions. The question made him pause, forcing him to consider the consequences of what he had done. For the first time, Hank felt the weight of his own cruelty. That night, Hank could not sleep. He lay in his large bed, staring at the wooden ceiling, haunted by the twins' calm, intelligent faces. He replayed the events of the evening over and over in his mind. What had seemed like harmless fun now felt like a mistake that could have lasting consequences. The girls' presence was unsettling in ways he had not anticipated. They were more than just children. They were observers, quietly judging him, making him confront the flaws in his character. As the hours passed, Hank realized something else. He respected them. Despite the bizarre and frightening circumstances, the twins had not lost their composure. They had not screamed or cried, nor had they begged. Their quiet intelligence and courage forced him to reflect on his own behavior, his arrogance, and his cruelty. The poker game, which had begun as a simple test of luck, had unexpectedly become a test of his humanity. By the time the first light of dawn crept over the horizon, Hank had come to a new understanding. The twins were no longer just part of a joke. They were individuals with wisdom and courage far beyond their years. Their calm, composed manner had made him see himself in a way he had never wanted to see, a man who could be cruel for amusement, blind to the feelings and dignity of others. The sun rose, casting long shadows across the ranch, and Hank knew that nothing would be the same again. The twins were still quiet, still observing, but he felt the weight of their presence in every glance, every measured word. The events of that evening were just beginning, and Hank sensed that the lessons to come would be more profound than any he had faced at the poker table. The first part of this story had set the stage, not for a simple joke, but for a confrontation with morality, courage, and the unexpected wisdom of two young girls who had quietly changed everything with a single question. The ranch lay at the edge of a wide, rolling plain, surrounded by tall wooden fences that creaked in the gentle evening wind. Hank's home was a large, sturdy building with rough-hewn walls and a wide porch that overlooked the pastures where horses grazed and cattle roamed. It was a place that spoke of wealth and hard work, a home built by someone used to commanding both land and people. Yet on this evening, despite the familiar creak of boards underfoot and the distant lowing of the herd, Hank felt a strange sense of unease. The twins followed him quietly, their small boots making almost no sound on the dusty ground. Their calm and deliberate steps mirrored each other, as if they moved in perfect synchrony. Hank had expected them to run, to resist, or at the very least to be fearful. Instead, they seemed to observe everything around them, their sharp eyes taking in details he had never noticed about his own ranch. He found it unnerving. Once inside, Hank showed them to a guest room that had been kept for travelers in passing. It was a modest space, with a wooden bed covered in a simple quilt, a small table and a chair. The sunlight that filtered through the window highlighted the dust in the air, making the room seem both warm and dusty at once. The twins glanced around slowly, noticing the placement of each piece of furniture, the rough texture of the walls, and the faint smell of the animals from the nearby barn. Hank watched them, expecting fear, confusion, or even tears. None came. Instead, they simply asked in the same calm, measured tone that had startled him earlier, "Where will we sleep? And what is expected of us?" The girls were not acting out of fear, they were assessing their situation. Their intelligence was evident, and Hank realized that the power he thought he held over them was not as absolute as he had believed. He cleared his throat, trying to regain some sense of authority. "You'll sleep here for now," he said, forcing a casual tone. "And well, you'll do as you're told while you're under my care." As the sun dipped lower and the sky turned shades of pink and purple, the twins settled into the room, carefully placing their belongings on the small table. Hank decided to give them a tour of the ranch, hoping to assert control and also perhaps to distract himself from the strange feeling their presence evoked. He led them outside, pointing out the barns, the stables, the pens where horses and cattle were kept, and even the far edges of the land where the fence met the wild prairie. The twins walked with him, listening carefully, asking occasional questions that were precise and pointed. "How do you keep the water clean for the animals?" one asked. "Do the workers always obey you?" asked the other. Each question was simple, yet each carried a quiet challenge, forcing Hank to think carefully before answering. As the night deepened, Hank prepared dinner in the kitchen while the twins quietly explored the main room of the house. He expected curiosity, perhaps even mischief, but they moved with a deliberate calm, touching nothing they were not invited to touch, observing everything with interest. He noticed that they took mental notes of the layout, the arrangement of tools, and the routines of the household. There was no malice in their actions, only intelligence and awareness. During dinner, Hank watched them closely. They ate politely, spoke softly to each other, and occasionally asked questions about the food or the ranch operations. Each word they spoke revealed insight beyond their years, and Hank felt a mix of admiration and unease. He had imagined a night of amusement, perhaps intimidation, but instead, he found himself being quietly examined by these two young girls. The realization was uncomfortable. He wondered how much they understood about the wager and the events that had brought them here. After dinner, he attempted to assert authority by giving them simple chores, fetching water, tidying up the small room. But even these instructions were met with calm, precise questions. "How much water should we bring?" one asked. "Do you want us to sweep the floor or just tidy the room?" Their responses were never disrespectful, but they were clearly evaluating him, assessing the limits of his commands. Hank realized that these were not ordinary children. They were clever, careful, and far more aware than he had anticipated. That night, as Hank prepared for bed, he could not stop thinking about the twins. Their first words, their calm questions, and their quiet observation weighed on him. He had expected fear or resistance, but what he encountered was a challenge in a form he had not imagined. The twins' presence forced him to confront the nature of his own actions. A poker game that had seemed like harmless fun now felt like a moral misstep, one he could not simply laugh off. Sleep came reluctantly. Hank tossed and turned, staring at the ceiling as the wind rattled the wooden panels of the house. He thought about their father, the merchant, who had reluctantly allowed the wager to take place. He thought about the townsfolk who had laughed nervously at the saloon, unsure of whether it was a joke or a serious transgression. And he thought about the twins themselves, whose calm intelligence had unsettled him more than any physical threat could have. By the next morning, the ranch was bathed in soft light. The twins rose early, quietly preparing for the day ahead. They cleaned their small room, arranged their belongings, and waited for Hank to begin the morning routines. Hank watched from the doorway, struck by their discipline and maturity. They moved as though they understood more than he had assumed possible, quietly learning the rhythm of ranch life while observing him at every turn. Hank decided to take them to see the animals. He led them to the barn, explaining how each animal was cared for, how the horses were trained, and how the cattle were fed. The twins listened intently, asking insightful questions about responsibility, feeding schedules, and even the reasoning behind the layout of the pens. Hank realized that they were learning quickly, but also that they were testing him, subtly questioning his choices and his authority. Each question required a careful, honest response, and Hank found himself pausing more than he was used to. By midday, Hank could feel a shift in himself. He no longer saw the twins as simply part of a cruel joke. They were observers, teachers in a strange way, showing him the consequences of thoughtlessness and arrogance. Their calm intelligence challenged him to reflect on his actions, and the more he engaged with them, the more he realized how ill-prepared he had been for this encounter. Even the ranch hands noticed the change. They watched as Hank, who had always been confident and commanding, hesitated, considered, and answered questions with care. The twins had a subtle influence on the ranch, one that went unnoticed by most but deeply affected Hank. He was beginning to see that courage did not always roar, and that wisdom often came quietly, in the form of simple, precise questions. That evening, as the sun dipped below the horizon, the twins sat quietly in their room while Hank reflected on the day. He realized that the so-called joke had become a serious lesson in humility and awareness. The poker game had been a test of luck, but the twins had turned it into a test of character. Hank understood that no amount of wealth or intimidation could replace the quiet strength and intelligence that these two young girls possessed. By the end of part 2, Hank was no longer the confident, arrogant rancher who had barged into the saloon the previous evening. He was thoughtful, uneasy, and respectful, though he would not admit it aloud. The twins had not only survived their first night and day on the ranch, but they had also begun to reshape the man who had thought he could control them with a joke. Their presence, calm intelligence, and precise questions had introduced a new reality, one in which Hank was not the master of all he surveyed, but a man confronted with the wisdom of those he had underestimated. The stage was now set for the next chapter, where the twins, insight and observation, would continue to challenge Hank, forcing him to confront not only his treatment of others, but also his understanding of fairness, responsibility, and the meaning of true strength. The ranch, once a symbol of power and control, had become a classroom, and Hank was its first reluctant student. The following morning, the ranch awakened to the usual sounds of life, the lowing of cattle, the soft whinny of horses in their stalls, and the gentle rustle of the wind through the tall grass surrounding the property. Hank rose early, as was his habit, but this time he felt a strange mixture of anticipation and unease. The presence of the twins, calm, observant, and unnervingly wise for their age, weighed on him like a silent challenge. They were no longer just part of a cruel joke from a poker game. They had become a mirror, reflecting his behavior and forcing him to confront aspects of himself he had long ignored. The twins were already awake when Hank stepped into the kitchen. Their small figures were silhouetted against the soft morning light streaming through the window. They moved with quiet precision, carrying out morning tasks with the kind of order and attentiveness that belied their years. Hank watched them silently for a moment, noticing the way they coordinated with each other without speaking, their subtle gestures conveying understanding and agreement. Even without words, they communicated in a way that made Hank pause, struck by their intelligence and unity. Breakfast was a quiet affair. The twins ate slowly, politely, and spoke in measured tones, asking questions about the food and the ranch routines. Their curiosity was neither mischievous nor demanding. It was deliberate, carefully aimed at understanding the rhythm and logic of Hank's world. "Why do you feed the horses before the cattle?" one asked, her eyes steady and unwavering. "Does the order matter?" He explained the logic of the routine, but with each answer, he realized that the twins were listening with more than just ears. They were listening with understanding, absorbing lessons about responsibility, observation, and careful thought. After breakfast, Hank decided to give the twins a tour of the ranch property beyond the fences. They walked together across the wide pastures, the early sunlight casting long shadows on the ground. The twins asked questions about every aspect of the ranch: the water supply, the fencing, the rotation of pastures, and even the way Hank interacted with the ranch hands. Their inquiries were never disrespectful, but they carried subtle implications, making Hank consider his decisions more carefully than he had ever done before. As they approached the edge of the property, where the land dipped into a shallow creek, one of the twins paused to examine the soil and the water. She asked, "Does this water reach all the animals in the pasture? How do you ensure it stays clean?" Her voice was calm, almost formal, but her question cut straight to the heart of responsibility. Hank realized he had never truly considered how the water supply affected all parts of the ranch, only that it had always worked. Her simple question forced him to examine something he had taken for granted. Throughout the day, Hank attempted to maintain the authority he was used to exercising. He assigned chores to the twins, helping to gather eggs, carrying small tools, tidying up supplies. But their responses were precise, careful, and occasionally challenging in subtle ways. "Would you like us to gather only the large eggs or all of them?" one asked. "Is there a specific order for the tools so that no one gets confused?" Their calm, reasoned questions suggested that they were not merely following instructions. They were learning, testing, and understanding the logic behind each task. Hank felt a strange mixture of pride and unease. He was proud because they were competent and intelligent, handling tasks with ease and accuracy. But he was uneasy because he realized that they were also quietly judging him, evaluating whether he was fair, honest, and thoughtful in his commands. Each question, each observation, carried a subtle weight, forcing him to reflect on his own behavior in ways he had never before encountered. By midday, Hank began to notice subtle changes in his own demeanor. He was more careful with his words, more deliberate in his actions, and more attentive to the needs of the ranch and its workers. The twins' presence had shifted the atmosphere entirely. Their calm intelligence and quiet observation were not just influencing him, they were reshaping him. Even the ranch hands began to notice. They saw Hank pausing before giving instructions, answering questions more thoughtfully, and considering consequences in ways he had previously ignored. The twins themselves remained composed, their curiosity never ceasing. They asked questions about fairness, about the treatment of animals, and about how Hank made decisions that affected everyone on the ranch. "Do you always treat the workers the same way?" one asked. "What happens if someone makes a mistake?" Hank was taken aback by the simplicity and depth of their questions. They were teaching him, in their quiet, indirect way, lessons about justice, responsibility, and empathy. Later that afternoon, Hank led them to the barn to observe the horses being groomed. The twins watched with intense focus as he demonstrated brushing techniques and explained the routines of feeding and care. One twin, her eyes sharp and attentive, asked, "Why do you groom the horses every day? Couldn't it be done less often?" Hank explained that grooming was not only about cleanliness but about forming trust and understanding with the animals, noticing signs of illness or stress early. The twin nodded thoughtfully, her silent approval clear. Hank began to realize something that unsettled him. He had underestimated the twins entirely. They were not just children in a strange situation. They were keen observers and astute learners. Their calm, precise questions forced him to consider aspects of his life and work he had ignored or taken for granted. For the first time, he felt that he was being held accountable not by another adult or a rival, but by two young girls whose insight surpassed their years. The day continued with more tasks and observations. The twins helped organize supplies, inspected the fences, and even asked to help with the milking of cows. Hank, initially hesitant, allowed them to assist, guiding their hands carefully. Their attention to detail impressed him. They followed instructions perfectly, noticing small mistakes he had not corrected in years. Their presence was quietly transformative, showing him that intelligence and discipline could emerge in unexpected forms. As the sun began to dip toward the horizon, Hank realized that the twins' influence extended beyond practical lessons. They were teaching him patience, humility, and the importance of careful observation. He reflected on his past actions, on the arrogance that had led him to treat others lightly, to gamble recklessly, and to assume control without thought. The twins' quiet wisdom was like a mirror, reflecting the flaws he had ignored for years. That evening, Hank prepared a simple meal and the twins joined him at the table. Their conversation was calm and polite, yet each word carried insight. They asked about his life, his decisions, and the choices he had made. Hank, for the first time, found himself answering honestly, sharing stories of his youth, his successes, and his mistakes. The twins listened without interruption, their eyes steady, and when they spoke, it was with thoughtful questions that made him reflect deeply on his past. As night fell, the ranch grew quiet. The twins retired to their room, and Hank found himself unable to sleep. He walked the porch, staring out at the vast plains under a sky filled with stars. He thought about the poker game that had begun this entire ordeal, and he realized that what he had thought of as a joke had become a profound lesson in character and responsibility. The twins' calm intelligence had reshaped his perspective, forcing him to confront the arrogance, cruelty, and thoughtlessness that he had long ignored. By the end of the day, Hank felt a subtle but undeniable change within himself. He was no longer the reckless, arrogant rancher who had barged into the saloon seeking amusement. He was thoughtful, reflective, and cautious, aware that the twins' presence had revealed weaknesses he could no longer deny. Their quiet wisdom had transformed his understanding of power, responsibility, and the way he treated others. The twins, for their part, had not acted with malice or defiance. They had quietly, calmly observed, asked questions, and reflected his actions back to him, teaching him lessons that no other adult could have. Hank realized that their influence was just beginning, and that the days to come would challenge him further, forcing him to grow in ways he had never imagined. By the time the first light of dawn appeared, Hank felt the weight of a lesson that could not be ignored. The twins were no longer just children in a strange circumstance. They were teachers, guides, and mirrors, revealing truths he had never wanted to face. And he knew, deep down, that the coming days would continue to test his character, patience, and understanding, as the twins quietly reshaped the life of a man who had once believed himself untouchable. The next morning, the ranch was alive with its usual sounds, but there was a new energy in the air. Hank woke early, as was his habit, but this time he moved with a quiet thoughtfulness rather than the usual confident stride. The presence of the twins had changed him in ways he could feel in his bones. He glanced toward the small room where the girls slept, noting how peaceful they looked, calm and undisturbed despite the strange circumstances that had brought them here. Their quiet composure had begun to transform his understanding of authority, responsibility, and humility. The twins rose and began their morning routines with precision. They tidied their small room, prepared themselves for the day, and waited patiently for Hank. Their movements were deliberate, reflecting a discipline and awareness that was remarkable for children their age. Hank watched them for a moment, realizing that he had underestimated their presence in ways he hadn't yet fully acknowledged. These were not ordinary children. They were observers and teachers, quietly showing him the path toward reflection and responsibility. After breakfast, Hank decided to involve the twins in the daily operations of the ranch. He led them to the barns, pointing out the different sections where horses, cattle, and other animals were kept. The twins asked detailed questions about the routines, why the horses were fed before the cattle, how the water supply was maintained, and how the ranch hands were assigned their duties. Their questions were not simple curiosity. They were carefully considered inquiries that forced Hank to explain his reasoning, and, in doing so, reflect on whether his methods were fair and effective. The twins also began to notice small inefficiencies and issues that Hank had overlooked for years. They pointed out that some of the fences near the creek were weak, that certain paths in the pasture were worn down and could become dangerous for the animals, and that the water troughs required more frequent cleaning. Hank, initially surprised, realized that their observations were not just accurate, they were practical and wise. Their attention to detail and logical thinking challenged him to reconsider his own complacency and prompted him to take steps to correct long-neglected issues. By midday, Hank had begun assigning the twins small responsibilities that required judgment and initiative. They helped repair fences, organized the tool shed, and assisted with feeding the animals. Each task was met with careful thought, questions, and suggestions from the girls, all offered respectfully and with precision. Hank realized that they were not just learning, they were quietly teaching him. They demonstrated that intelligence, careful observation, and thoughtful action could have more impact than brute strength or fear. As the day wore on, Hank noticed subtle changes in his own behavior. He found himself listening more carefully, considering the consequences of his actions, and thinking about the feelings and needs of others. The twins had shown him that leadership was not about dominating or instilling fear. It was about understanding, responsibility, and fairness. Even the ranch hands, who had always been cautious around Hank's temper, began to notice the transformation in him. They saw a man who paused before giving instructions, who answered questions thoughtfully, and who genuinely considered the advice of even the youngest observers. The twins themselves continued to challenge Hank, but in a calm and respectful way. They asked questions about his life, his decisions, and the way he treated others. "Do you always consider the feelings of the people who work for you?" one asked. "Have you ever regretted your choices?" asked the other. Each question carried weight, making Hank reflect deeply on his past and consider the path he wanted to take in the future. He realized that the twins were teaching him lessons far beyond the practical tasks of running a ranch. They were teaching him about character, empathy, and integrity. As evening approached, Hank gathered the twins to sit on the porch with him. The sky was painted with the soft hues of sunset, and the air carried the faint scent of hay and earth. The twins spoke calmly about what they had observed during the day, highlighting areas where the ranch could improve and asking thoughtful questions about why things had been done in certain ways. Hank listened carefully, noting their intelligence, their insight, and their ability to convey observations in a way that was respectful yet unyielding. Hank realized that the poker game that had brought the twins to his ranch had been a turning point in his life. What he had thought of as a cruel joke had become a profound lesson. The twins' quiet wisdom had forced him to confront his flaws, reconsider his choices, and understand the importance of fairness, care, and responsibility. They had taught him that true strength was not in domination or fear, but in observation, understanding, and thoughtful action. Later that night, Hank reflected on the events that had brought him to this point. The twins' father, the merchant, had entrusted their care to him reluctantly, expecting nothing more than compliance. Instead, the girls had transformed the household, challenging Hank's assumptions and guiding him toward a deeper understanding of himself and his responsibilities. Their presence had created an atmosphere of reflection and growth, one that would leave a lasting impact on him long after their departure. The following days continued in this pattern. The twins observed, questioned, and contributed, while Hank listened, learned, and adapted. They offered practical advice, pointed out areas for improvement, and asked questions that forced him to consider not only his methods but his motivations and values. Hank realized that he was becoming a better man, more thoughtful, patient, and considerate than he had ever been. The ranch, once a symbol of power and control, had become a place of learning and reflection. When the twins' father returned to collect them, Hank felt a mixture of relief and sadness. He had come to respect and even admire the girls for their intelligence, maturity, and quiet strength. Their time at the ranch had taught him lessons that no other experience could have offered, and he knew that the change within him was lasting. As the twins prepared to leave, Hank spoke sincerely, thanking them for the lessons they had taught him. The girls smiled gently, their expressions calm and composed, as if to say that their purpose had been fulfilled. As Hank watched them walk away with their father, he felt a profound sense of gratitude. The ranch, the poker game, and the wager had all seemed trivial and foolish at the start, but the twins had transformed the situation into something meaningful. They had shown him that intelligence, courage, and calm wisdom could inspire change in ways that brute force or intimidation never could. Hank knew that his life had been forever altered by their presence, and that he would carry the lessons they taught him for the rest of his days. In the days and weeks that followed, Hank applied what he had learned. He treated his ranch hands with greater fairness and respect, listened more carefully to advice, and considered the consequences of his actions before acting. The lessons from the twins had left an indelible mark on his character. The poker game that had seemed like a reckless joke was now remembered not for the absurdity of the wager, but for the profound change it had sparked in a man who had once believed that power and fear were the keys to respect. The story of the twins and the rancher became known throughout the town, told not as a tale of cruelty, but as a lesson in humility, wisdom, and the quiet strength of two young girls who had forever changed a man's life. People remembered Hank as a rancher who had learned the value of listening, observing, and treating others with thoughtfulness and care. And the twins who had returned to their father remained a quiet legend, symbols of intelligence, courage, and the power of gentle wisdom to transform even the hardest of hearts. Hank often thought back to their calm voices, their steady eyes, and the questions that had forced him to reflect. They had taught him more than he had ever expected, not with force or anger but with patience, observation, and insight. And in that quiet transformation, Hank found something he had never known before, a deeper understanding of himself, of responsibility, and of the power of thoughtful reflection. The ranch continued to prosper, but now under a different kind of leadership. Hank led with wisdom, fairness, and care, mindful of the lessons taught by two young girls who had arrived under the strangest of circumstances and left with a lasting impact on a man's heart and mind. The poker game was long forgotten, but the lessons remained, a permanent reminder that intelligence, courage, and calm observation could change even the most stubborn and arrogant hearts. And so life on the ranch went on, quieter, wiser, and richer, not in wealth, but in understanding, respect, and the quiet strength that comes from true learning. Hank never forgot the twins or the lesson they had taught him. That power is not in winning, but in listening, understanding, and growing as a person.